Imagine opening your eyes one morning and discovering that every hardship you've carried through life, every moment of weakness, every pain that made you feel less than whole, was never your fault. Imagine realizing that your trembling hands, your heavy breath, your confusion and exhaustion were not the random misfortunes of fate, but the result of decisions made centuries before you were born. You are the product of an obsession, not of love. Your mother is your cousin. Your father is also your uncle. Your grandmother is, at the same time, your great-aunt. The very idea of a family tree collapses here, because there are no branches, no new directions, no space to grow. Instead, it is a tangled vine coiling around itself, suffocating the generations that come after. This is not a story from a Gothic novel, nor a grotesque legend designed to frighten. For countless women and men throughout Europe's history, this was reality. They lived trapped in dynasties where marriages were never about choice or affection, but about survival of power, protection of land, and the illusion of purity. Before we enter their world, before we look into the silent eyes of women who endured unspeakable suffering in gilded prisons, let me pause to say this. If history's hidden truths capture your imagination, if you believe the past has stories that still echo into our lives today, then join this exploration. Think about where you are listening from, because across oceans and continents, separated by centuries yet bound by curiosity, we are about to step into chambers where queens wept, where mothers buried their children, and where kings themselves became symbols of decay. To understand these forgotten lives, we must first unravel the twisted reasoning that created them. For centuries, Europe's monarchies believed they were not merely rulers, but chosen beings. Their blood was described as azul, blue blood, divinely sanctified, set apart from that of common people. They convinced themselves that God had placed them above others, and that intermingling with ordinary blood would dilute their sacred right to rule. Thus, a cruel logic took root. Cousins would marry cousins, uncles would wed their nieces, and siblings themselves would be bound in unions. All in the name of preserving something they thought untouchable, the sanctity of their line. By the 16th century, this practice had turned Europe's nobility into one vast, interconnected web. Behind the splendor of court life, these choices were quietly reshaping the very bodies of those who sat on thrones. Generations of intermarriage introduced hidden weaknesses. Children were born smaller, weaker, more vulnerable to disease. Minds clouded earlier. Bones broke more easily. And yet the system continued, because the fear of losing power outweighed any concern for human cost. No dynasty embodied this tragic cycle more than the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain. Their influence stretched across empires, their marriages binding together vast territories. Their unofficial motto said it plainly, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did, not across continents, not across kingdoms, but within their own blood. What looked, on the surface, like brilliant political maneuvering was in truth a slow-motion disaster. As generation after generation turned inward, the Habsburg family was sowing the seeds of its own collapse. The legacy they left behind was not just crowns and empires, but bodies frail and broken, and lives lived in relentless suffering. And so, our journey into this world of gilded misery begins. It is Vienna, the year 1634. Behind the towering walls of palaces, where music plays and candles flicker, a young woman named Maria Anna of Spain steps into her role as empress. But her crown is no blessing. It is a weight carried on shoulders already weakened by bloodlines too tightly bound. In the year 1606, Maria Anna of Spain was born into one of the most powerful dynasties in the world, the Habsburg family. To outsiders, her birth was a cause for celebration, another jewel in the crown of Europe's most influential house. But to those who understood the reality of her lineage, her life was already marked by shadows. From the very beginning, her destiny was not her own. She was to be a tool in the endless strategy of alliances, her body pledged to a marriage arranged long before she could even comprehend what it meant. Her path was sealed when she was given in marriage to her cousin, Ferdinand III of Austria, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor. To the world, this union symbolized the strengthening of ties between two powerful branches of the Habsburg line. Court chronicles praised the match, calling it a triumph of politics and divine order. But beneath these glowing accounts lay the truth. Maria Anna's marriage was yet another link in a chain of intermarriage that had long been tightening around her family's future. From her youth, Maria Anna's health was fragile. Reports describe her as delicate, her skin pale, her strength fleeting. Ambassadors at court often noted her persistent coughs, her frequent fevers, and the way she seemed to carry fatigue as though it were a constant companion. Physicians, limited in their understanding, prescribed tonics and prayers, but nothing could ease the inherited frailty etched into her bloodline. Despite her weakness, Maria Anna was expected to fulfill her duty as empress, to produce heirs who would carry on the Habsburg legacy. Over the course of her marriage, she gave birth to 6 children. But joy was always tempered by sorrow. One by one, her children were taken by illness, their small bodies unable to withstand the same burdens that plagued their mother. Only one son, Ferdinand IV, survived into adulthood, and even he carried the fragility of his lineage. His reign was short-lived, ending at the age of 21, his body unable to carry the weight of kingship any longer. Imagine the toll this took on Maria Anna. Behind the ornate walls of Vienna's palaces, she mourned silently, her grief hidden beneath layers of royal protocol. Each funeral, each tiny coffin lowered into the earth, was not just the loss of a child but the reminder of her family's curse. Still, the court expected her to smile, to host, to play the role of empress as though she were untouched by pain. For Maria Anna, the crown was not a symbol of glory, but of chains. She lived in a body weakened by centuries of intermarriage, and her personal tragedies were amplified by the weight of dynastic expectation. Her every breath was measured not as a woman's life, but as a pawn in a game of power. When history remembers Maria Anna of Spain, it often does so through her titles and her marriage. But beneath the surface lies a story of resilience in the face of relentless suffering. She represents not just the fate of a single woman, but the shared experience of countless queens, mothers, and daughters who bore the cost of dynastic obsession. Maria Anna's life is a haunting reflection of how power, when pursued without humanity, can turn palaces into prisons and crowns into instruments of suffering. Joanna of Austria was born in 1535, the daughter of Emperor Charles V, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Her very birth was political, her childhood shaped by expectations far larger than herself. From the moment she opened her eyes, Joanna's future was determined not by dreams or desires, but by dynastic necessity. She was to marry not for love, not for companionship, but for strategy. Her body, like those of so many women in her family, was considered a vessel through which alliances would be forged and empires would be preserved. At just 16 years old, Joanna was married to her cousin, Prince John of Portugal. To the world, this union was celebrated as a triumph, a joining of 2 of Europe's greatest powers. The court was filled with pageantry, music, and declarations of prosperity. But beneath the glittering surface was the same reality that haunted every Habsburg bride. She was marrying into the same bloodline that had already begun to choke itself through generations of intermarriage. Her marriage, though politically significant, was tragically short. Within 2 years, Prince John was dead, leaving Joanna a widow before she had even reached adulthood. She was only 18, draped in black mourning robes, her youth stolen by grief. The loss was not just personal, it was dynastic. Her family had invested their hopes in this match, and now those hopes had crumbled. Yet Joanna's role as a Habsburg woman did not allow her to retreat into sorrow. She was quickly forced into another burden, motherhood. She gave birth to a son, Sebastian, who would later ascend the Portuguese throne. But like so many children born from the tightly wound web of royal intermarriage, Sebastian was marked by frailty. His health was poor, his growth uncertain. Ambassadors noted his pale complexion, his frequent illnesses, and his fragile frame. The dynasty celebrated him as a symbol of continuity, but his body already bore the silent scars of his ancestry. Joanna's grief was compounded by her isolation. After her husband's death, she returned to Spain, but even there she was not free. Her father, Charles V, had retreated into a monastery, leaving the burden of governance to others. Joanna herself was entrusted with political responsibilities as regent of Spain during her brother Philip II's absence. This was unusual for a woman of her time, and it demonstrated her strength of character and sharp intellect. Yet even in power, she was never truly in control of her own destiny. Behind the walls of her palaces, Joanna carried the loneliness of widowhood, the weight of motherhood, and the silent knowledge that her son's frailty mirrored the decline of her family line. Her diaries and letters reveal a woman of deep piety, who sought solace in faith when human comforts were denied to her. Religion became her refuge, though even this could not shield her from the tragedies that marked her life. Her son Sebastian would grow into a young king filled with ambition but cursed with weakness. He died at just 24, his dreams of glory in Morocco ending in catastrophe. His death extinguished the direct line of the Portuguese throne and plunged the kingdom into crisis. For Joanna, who had already endured so much, this was the ultimate heartbreak, to see her only child consumed by the very legacy that had once promised greatness. Joanna of Austria's story is not one of triumph, but of endurance. She represents the quiet suffering of royal women whose lives were dictated by political necessity and genetic fate. She was intelligent, capable, and deeply devoted, but none of these virtues could protect her from the consequences of a family tree that refused to branch. Her life reminds us that beneath the crowns and titles, beneath the ceremonies and portraits, were human beings, daughters, mothers, widows, living in the shadow of decisions they never chose. Joanna's endurance in the face of personal loss and dynastic failure makes her one of the most poignant figures in the long, tragic saga of Habsburg women. Margaret of Austria, born in 1584, was yet another daughter of the Habsburg dynasty whose life was marked from the very beginning by the family's relentless pursuit of dynastic preservation. Like many women before her, she was destined not to choose her path, but to embody the political strategies of her house. From childhood, she was trained to be a bride, her every lesson, her every gesture shaped to prepare her for the role she would one day play on Europe's grand stage. At 25 years old, Margaret was married to her cousin, Philip III of Spain. The match was celebrated across Europe as a union that would strengthen the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs, securing alliances and continuing the line that had come to dominate so much of the continent. But behind the golden curtains of wedding celebrations, the truth was painfully clear. Margaret was entering a marriage that was less about companionship and more about bloodlines that were already dangerously entangled. Margaret's health was never strong. Like her Habsburg relatives, she suffered from frequent illnesses and a constitution weakened by generations of intermarriage. Observers at court often remarked on her delicate frame, her pale face, and her exhaustion. Yet despite her frailty, she bore the enormous responsibility of producing heirs for the Spanish throne. Over the course of her marriage, she gave birth to 8 children, but tragedy shadowed nearly every cradle. Many of her infants died young, their small bodies unable to survive the genetic weaknesses that haunted the dynasty. Only a handful of her children lived beyond infancy, and even they carried the physical and mental burdens of their ancestry. Her son Philip IV, who would later rule Spain, inherited the infamous Habsburg jaw, a deformity caused by generations of inbreeding that distorted the shape of the face and jaw. More than a mere physical trait, this deformity symbolized the dynasty's decline, visible proof of choices made over centuries. Margaret herself was a deeply pious woman, devoted to her Catholic faith. She spent long hours in prayer, seeking strength in religion to cope with the losses she endured. Letters and records from her contemporaries describe her as kind, gentle, and charitable, often intervening at court to help the poor or to soften her husband's harsh policies. Yet her kindness could not shield her from her own suffering. Each pregnancy weakened her body further, and the constant strain of childbirth, combined with her already fragile health, eventually claimed her life. In 1611, at the age of just 26, Margaret died while giving birth to her 8th child. Her death was not unusual for her time, but it carried a symbolic weight. She had given everything: her youth, her health, her very life in service to a dynasty that valued her more as a vessel than as a woman. Her passing was mourned, but it did not stop the cycle. The court quickly turned its attention to the surviving children and to the next generation of marriages that would continue the Habsburg legacy. Margaret's short life tells us much about the human cost of dynastic obsession. She was praised as a devout queen and a loyal wife, but history seldom pauses to consider the suffering she endured, the endless pregnancies, the funerals of her children, the slow erosion of her own body. In her story, we see not only the decline of a dynasty, but the quiet tragedy of a woman who carried the unbearable weight of her family's choices. Margaret of Austria stands as a poignant reminder of how history often celebrates crowns and thrones while forgetting the human lives sacrificed to uphold them. Behind her title was a young woman whose only real crime was being born into a family that valued bloodlines over humanity. Elizabeth of Austria was born in 1554, another daughter of the sprawling Habsburg dynasty. From the moment of her birth, her identity was less that of an individual child and more that of a pawn in a game of dynastic politics. She was not Elizabeth, the girl with hopes and fears. She was Elizabeth, the future bride, the link in a chain meant to strengthen alliances and keep power tightly within the family's grasp. Her marriage was arranged to Charles IX of France, a union that brought together two powerful European thrones. To the courts of Europe, it was a dazzling match. A young Austrian princess, delicate and obedient, becoming Queen of France. For Elizabeth herself, it was a departure from her homeland, her childhood, and everything familiar. At just 16 years old, she was sent to a foreign land to live with a husband she hardly knew, a man plagued by his own frailties and the violence of his time. France was no gentle place for Elizabeth. Her marriage to Charles IX was marked by turbulence and tragedy. The young king was often sickly, moody, and volatile, bearing the same burdens of hereditary weakness that afflicted so many of his relatives. His reign was scarred by the wars of religion, and Elizabeth, though queen, had little power to influence events. She stood as a figurehead, draped in jewels, while the nation bled around her. Elizabeth's role was simple yet cruelly demanding. She was expected to provide heirs. In 1572, she gave birth to a daughter, Marie Elizabeth of Valois. The court celebrated, but their joy was tempered by disappointment. She had not produced a male heir, and her fragile health made it uncertain whether she could endure further pregnancies. Indeed, her body, weakened by the same interwoven bloodlines that had weakened so many Habsburgs before her, struggled with the toll of childbirth. She would bear no more children. The greatest tragedy of Elizabeth's life, however, was not simply her health or her isolation, but the horror she was forced to witness. Only weeks after the birth of her daughter, France descended into one of its darkest episodes, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Protestants were slaughtered in Paris and across the country. Elizabeth, a devout and pious Catholic, was reportedly horrified by the violence. She was just 18 years old, far from her homeland, watching the blood of innocents run in the streets of the kingdom she was meant to help rule. Her husband, Charles IX, grew increasingly unstable. His health, already frail, deteriorated rapidly. Consumed by illness, coughing blood, and racked with guilt over the massacre, he died in 1574 at just 23 years old. Elizabeth, widowed at 20, was left alone in a foreign land with a young daughter. Court intrigues swirled around her, but she was now a widow queen, stripped of influence, her value to the French crown diminished. After Charles's death, Elizabeth returned to Austria. She never remarried, choosing instead a life of piety and seclusion. Her remaining years were marked by religious devotion, as she withdrew from the political world that had taken her youth and filled it with sorrow. She died at the age of 30, remembered more as a tragic symbol of her dynasty than as the vibrant young woman she once was. Elizabeth of Austria's life illustrates the cruel paradox of royal women, celebrated as queens, yet powerless, adorned with crowns, yet stripped of choice. She endured a marriage to a man she barely knew, the trauma of violence beyond imagining, and the frailty of a body weakened by inherited genetic decline. She was a queen in title, but in truth, she was a prisoner of circumstance, her fate written long before she was born. Her story reminds us that behind the gilded portraits and the solemn titles, these women lived lives filled with grief, loss, and sacrifice. Elizabeth was not just the Queen of France. She was a daughter torn from home, a mother burdened with fragile hope, and a widow before she had even lived half her years. If there is one figure who embodies the full weight of the Habsburg dynasty's obsession with blood purity, it is Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, he entered the world as both a king-in-waiting and a living monument to centuries of inbreeding. His very body, from the moment of his birth, carried the signs of decline that generations of royal marriages within the same family had created. Contemporaries called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, a cruel nickname that reflected both his pitiful health and the superstitions that surrounded him. People whispered that he was cursed, that sorcery had left him weak, sterile, and half-mad. But in truth, there was no witchcraft. His condition was the direct, inevitable result of the Habsburg marriage strategies, which had folded the family tree inward again and again until it was no longer a tree at all, but a suffocating vine. Charles was the son of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, who were uncle and niece. This meant that Charles's genetic makeup was more concentrated than if his parents had been siblings. The effects were devastating. From infancy, he was frail. He did not learn to walk until the age of 4, and he could not speak properly until around age 8. His face bore the infamous Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that he struggled to chew food and was often unable to close his mouth fully. His tongue was unusually large, which made speech difficult and eating painful. Chronic digestive problems left him thin, weak, and constantly sick. As he grew older, the court attempted to mask his disabilities, presenting him as a monarch touched by divine mystery. But reality could not be hidden. He was prone to seizures, frequent infections, and episodes of profound mental and physical exhaustion. Despite being king of one of the largest empires in the world, Charles was often treated more like a child than a ruler, his affairs controlled by regents, advisors, and ambitious nobles who exploited his weakness. The greatest tragedy of Charles's reign was not only his frailty but his inability to produce an heir. He was married twice, first to Marie Louise of Orleans, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both marriages were childless. For a dynasty that had sacrificed so much to preserve its bloodline, this was the ultimate irony. Centuries of intermarriage had left their final king too weak, too infertile, too broken to continue the line. The Spanish court, desperate for an explanation, often blamed witchcraft. Priests performed exorcisms, and Charles himself believed that he was cursed. Yet modern science reveals the truth. Genetic disorders caused by inbreeding had ravaged his health. Studies of his ancestry show that more than 25% of his genes were identical, a level of genetic similarity far greater than what would be seen in a child of siblings. His condition was not supernatural, it was biological. Politically, Charles's reign was disastrous. Spain, once the mightiest empire in Europe, crumbled under his rule. Bankruptcies, military defeats, and declining influence all marked his time on the throne. His weakness as a ruler accelerated the decline of Spanish power, and his inability to father children plunged Europe into crisis. When Charles II died in 1700 at the age of 38, he was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. His body, according to reports, was grotesquely deformed, emaciated, riddled with disease, and scarred by years of suffering. Autopsy accounts, though likely exaggerated by rumor, claimed that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, and his intestines filled with decay. Whether entirely accurate or not, these descriptions reflected how contemporaries saw him, as the tragic endpoint of a dynasty that had destroyed itself. Charles II's death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped Europe for decades. But beyond politics and war, his life stands as one of history's starkest warnings. He was not bewitched, nor cursed by fate. He was the product of choices, of a dynasty that valued power above humanity, blood purity above health, and political calculation above the lives of its children. Charles II of Spain was, in many ways, less a king than a victim. His life reminds us that even those who wore crowns and lived in palaces could suffer in ways that were unimaginable, their bodies carrying the silent cost of centuries of decisions made in gilded halls. He was the last breath of a dynasty that had strangled itself, a man remembered not for victories or glory, but for the tragic frailty that ended an empire. Maria Theresa of Spain was born in 1638, the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France. From the instant of her birth, she was more than a royal child, she was a political prize. Her life, like that of so many Habsburg daughters before her, would not be guided by personal desire but by dynastic strategy. As a young infanta of Spain, Maria Theresa grew up in an empire of grandeur, but also one already weakened by years of decline. Spain's golden age was fading, its vast empire strained by wars, bankruptcies, and the slow decay of its power. Within this context, Maria Theresa's future became a matter of international importance. She would not only represent her father's ambitions but serve as a bargaining tool to preserve Spain's influence in Europe. Her marriage was arranged to Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, in 1660, sealing the Treaty of the Pyrenees that ended years of war between Spain and France. To the outside world, this union was the crowning achievement of diplomacy, the two most powerful Catholic monarchies in Europe bound together by marriage. The glittering spectacle of her wedding was celebrated with pageantry, music, and proclamations of peace. But for Maria Theresa herself, it was the beginning of a lifetime of sacrifice and silence. From the start, her marriage was unequal. Louis XIV was one of the most dominant rulers in European history, confident, ambitious, and determined to shine as the center of his realm. Maria Theresa, in contrast, was quiet, timid, and already marked by the frailty of her Habsburg blood. Court observers often described her as gentle and pious, but also as physically delicate, with the pale complexion and frequent illnesses so common among her family. As Queen of France, her primary duty was clear: to provide heirs for the Bourbon dynasty. She bore 6 children, but only one survived into adulthood, the future Dauphin Louis. The others died young, claimed by the same shadow of fragility that haunted Habsburg offspring across Europe. Each loss weighed heavily on Maria Theresa, though the glittering French court allowed little space for her grief. Her position at Versailles was a lonely one. Louis XIV surrounded himself with mistresses, flaunting his affairs openly. Maria Theresa endured these humiliations in silence, her dignity intact but her heart quietly breaking. She was queen in name, but in practice she was sidelined, reduced to ceremonial appearances and overshadowed by the king's lovers. Despite this, she remained steadfast in her devotion to Louis, even declaring on her deathbed that she had loved him all her life. Physically, Maria Theresa's health continued to deteriorate as the years passed. Her body, weakened by repeated pregnancies and the genetic inheritance of her lineage, could not withstand the rigors of life at court. She was often exhausted, frequently ill, and increasingly isolated. Her piety deepened, and she spent long hours in prayer, seeking solace in faith for the sorrow she endured silently. In 1683, at the age of 44, Maria Theresa died after complications from yet another childbirth. Her death, though tragic, barely interrupted the rhythms of the French court. Louis XIV mourned her briefly but quickly resumed his glittering reign, surrounded by wealth and splendor, as though the queen who had given him children and endured decades of humiliation had been little more than a shadow in his world. Yet Maria Theresa's legacy extended beyond her quiet life and lonely death. Through her son, the Dauphin, she became the grandmother of future kings of France. More importantly, her marriage to Louis XIV provided the Bourbon dynasty with a claim to the Spanish throne. This claim would later ignite the War of the Spanish Succession after the death of Charles II of Spain, linking her fate directly to the collapse of her own family line. Maria Theresa of Spain's story is one of silence, sacrifice, and endurance. She was born into one crumbling empire and married into another that demanded everything from her while giving little in return. She was a queen who smiled for the court, prayed for her lost children, and suffered in silence while her husband basked in glory. Her life reflects the cruel reality of dynastic marriages. Women were used as living treaties, their bodies bargaining chips in the pursuit of power. Behind the crown and the elaborate gowns was a woman whose life was consumed by grief, whose health was destroyed by duty, and whose love remained unreciprocated. In Maria Theresa, we see the human cost of politics written not in treaties or wars, but in the quiet suffering of a woman who gave everything to her dynasty, only to be remembered as a footnote in her husband's reign. Anne of Austria was born in 1601, the eldest daughter of King Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. Though her title suggests Austria, she was in fact a Spanish princess, raised in the glittering yet suffocating world of the Habsburg courts. From birth, her destiny was sealed. She would be a bride whose marriage was meant to strengthen alliances, not a woman free to choose her own path. At the age of 14, Anne was sent to France to marry Louis XIII. The marriage was not simply a personal union but a diplomatic maneuver meant to end years of hostility between France and Spain. To the people, the sight of the young Spanish princess crossing into French lands was a symbol of hope, of peace between two powerful and often warring kingdoms. To Anne herself, it was the beginning of a life of loneliness and constant struggle. Her marriage to Louis XIII was deeply troubled from the very beginning. Louis was cold, distant, and often indifferent to his young bride. He preferred the company of his advisors and his hunts to the quiet, nervous girl he had married, and, raised in the strict etiquette of the Spanish court, struggled to adapt to the more open and politically charged environment of France. Court observers noted her shyness and her difficulty in speaking French, which left her isolated and often mocked. Worse still, the couple's marriage remained childless for over 20 years. For a queen, this was not just a personal sorrow but a political disaster. Whispers circulated through the court that Anne was barren, cursed, or punished by God. Every passing year without an heir fueled political instability, and Anne herself became the subject of suspicion and ridicule. The king's mistrust of her only deepened when she was accused of conspiring with Spain during France's conflicts. At one point, her correspondence with her brother, King Philip IV of Spain, was even intercepted, further straining her already fragile relationship with Louis. Despite these humiliations, Anne endured. Her faith was her anchor, and she turned increasingly to religion for strength. She spent long hours in prayer, finding in devotion the comfort that her marriage did not provide. Yet her patience and resilience would eventually change the course of history. In 1638, after more than 2 decades of marriage, Anne finally gave birth to a son, Louis Dieudonné, who would later become Louis XIV, the Sun King. His very name, Dieudonné, given by God, reflected the belief that his birth was a miracle, a divine blessing after years of barrenness. 4 years later, Anne bore another son, Philippe, securing the succession and finally silencing her critics. Anne's life, however, was not simply defined by her struggles as a wife and mother. When Louis XIII died in 1643, leaving their son Louis XIV only 4 years old, and assumed the role of regent of France. For the first time, the shy Spanish princess, long dismissed and underestimated, wielded real power. With the help of her trusted advisor, Cardinal Mazarin, Anne steered France through the turbulent years of her son's minority. She defended the crown during the civil wars known as the Fronde, showing a strength and determination that surprised even her enemies. As regent, Anne proved herself capable and resilient, protecting her son's throne until he was old enough to rule on his own. Yet even in this moment of triumph, she was not free from the sorrows of her lineage. Her health, like that of so many Habsburgs, was fragile. Years of stress, grief, and the burdens of childbirth left her weakened. In her later life, she withdrew increasingly into religion, finding solace in her faith as her body failed. Anne of Austria died in 1666 at the age of 64. By then, her son Louis XIV was firmly established as one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Yet her role in securing his throne, her endurance through decades of humiliation, suspicion, and sorrow, is often overshadowed by his glory. Anne's story is one of transformation, from a lonely, ridiculed bride to a strong and determined queen regent. She embodies the resilience of Habsburg women who endured marriages without love, courts filled with hostility, and the crushing expectations of dynastic duty. Her life reveals the quiet strength hidden beneath the crowns and gowns, the strength of a woman who endured personal pain yet shaped the future of France through her perseverance. Anne of Austria reminds us that history often remembers the kings, but behind them stood queens whose struggles were just as defining. She was not simply Louis XII's wife or Louis XIV's mother, she was a woman who bore the weight of two great dynasties, sacrificing her happiness for their survival. Isabella Clara Eugenia, 1566 to 1633, daughter of Philip II of Spain and Elizabeth of Valois, was one of the few Habsburg women entrusted with real political power. Unlike many of her cousins who were married off as pawns, she was raised to govern. In 1599, she married Archduke Albert of Austria, and together they were granted joint sovereignty over the Spanish Netherlands. Their reign was remembered as one of relative peace compared to the bloody decades that came before. Isabella worked tirelessly with her husband to stabilize the region, balance Catholic orthodoxy with governance, and restore prosperity to war-torn provinces. Yet even her reign bore the marks of dynastic fragility. Despite multiple pregnancies, she left no surviving children. The curse of infertility that plagued the Habsburgs robbed her of heirs, and when Albert died in 1621, she ruled alone as the governor of the Netherlands until her death in 1633. Isabella's life reflects both the strength and tragedy of her lineage, a capable ruler admired by her subjects, yet ultimately another Habsburg princess whose body could not break free from the genetic fate of her family. No story captures the collapse of the Habsburg dynasty more clearly than that of Charles II of Spain, 1661 to 1700. Nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, Charles was the most tragic result of centuries of intermarriage. His jaw was so deformed that he could barely chew food. His tongue was oversized, making speech difficult. His body was weak, stunted, and plagued with illness. More than his physical suffering, Charles was mentally fragile, often unable to focus or make decisions. European courts whispered that he was cursed, the victim of sorcery. In truth, he was the living proof of genetic collapse. His family tree showed generations of uncles marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins, until diversity in bloodlines had all but vanished. Charles married twice, but both unions were childless. His death in 1700 at just 38 years old marked the end of the Spanish Habsburgs. His will named Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon, as his heir, plunging Europe into the War of Spanish Succession. With Charles, the dynasty that had once dominated Europe ended, not with triumph, but with a broken body symbolizing its downfall. Maria Anna of Austria, 1606 to 1646, was another victim of dynastic obsession. She was married to her uncle, Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, in one of the many incestuous unions meant to strengthen the Habsburg grip on power. Her life was one of constant pregnancies, most ending in grief. Many of her children died in infancy, and those who survived were often frail and sickly. Despite her personal tragedies, Maria Anna was deeply religious, supporting Catholic reforms and education during the Counter-Reformation. Like so many Habsburg women, she bore her suffering silently, fulfilling her role as empress while enduring the slow destruction of her health. Maria Anna's story is less well known than others, but it represents the silent majority of Habsburg women, those whose names are hidden in genealogies, remembered not for themselves but for the children they bore and buried. The stories of Margaret, Elizabeth, and Isabella, Maria Anna, and Charles II together reveal the devastating human cost of dynastic obsession. For centuries, the Habsburgs believed that preserving pure blood guaranteed divine favor and political strength. Instead, it created a genetic trap, producing generations of fragile rulers and suffering queens. These women were not merely wives or mothers, they were vessels for dynastic ambition. They endured endless pregnancies, miscarriages, sickly children, and the crushing burden of expectation. Some, like Isabella Clara Eugenia and Anne of Austria, rose to political power and proved themselves capable leaders. Others, like Margaret and Maria Anna, paid with their health and their lives. And at the dynasty's tragic peak stood Charles II, whose broken body embodied centuries of choices made by others. In the end, the Habsburgs remind us that history often glorifies crowns, battles, and empires, while the human suffering beneath those crowns is forgotten. These women's lives were stories of endurance, sacrifice, and silent pain, stories that deserve to be remembered alongside the kings and empires they helped sustain.